Good morning, evening boss. Today's episode is strange, and the stories are even stranger and more terrifying than the truth. So I need you to focus on me and isolate yourself from the planet. I was actually surprised while you were writing this episode. Let's begin, boss. Keep your high beams burning, my dark family, because out here on the midnight freight lines, the scales never close, and the road always collects its toll. My name is Clark, and back in the suffocating, humid heat of the summer of 1977, at exactly 15 minutes past 2 in the morning, I was steering my heavy freight liner down a deserted, pitch-black backroad in rural Alabama, my knuckles locked right around the steering wheel while the ancient dashboard rattled in protest against the relentless vibration of the oversized diesel block. The air outside the cab was thick, heavy, and punishingly hot, carrying the acrid stench of burning diesel fuel, hot asphalt, and rotting pine needles that drifted in through the cracked side window. The cabin felt like a rolling oven, the old auxiliary fan rattling uselessly against the suffocating humidity while I wiped the thick, salty sweat from my forehead with the back of a grease-stained forearm, my eyes burning from hours of staring into the narrow amber cones cast by my aging headlamps. The deep silence of the midnight route was broken only by the rhythmic, deafening roar of the exhaust stacks and the endless clicking of the mechanical odometer ticking away another lonely mile in the absolute dark. Then, cutting sharply through the shadows, my high beams illuminated a horrifying sight dead ahead, an overturned sedan resting heavily on the narrow gravel shoulder, and a woman's body sprawled motionless directly in the middle of the empty lane, completely drenched in dark, gleaming blood that caught the amber light of my headlamps like wet glass. Instinct and human decency overrode every warning bell ringing in the back of my mind. I slammed my foot hard onto the air brakes, the heavy rig hissing sharply as it skidded to a violent, shuddering halt in a thick cloud of choking dust and loose gravel. Grabbing a heavy iron crowbar and a high-powered flashlight from the passenger seat, I shoved the heavy cab door open and stepped out into the sweltering, dead silence of the Alabama night, my boots crunching loudly on the dry dirt. I hurried toward the fallen woman, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I called out into the dark, scanning the dense tree line for any sign of movement. "Miss? Can you hear me? Do you need help?" There was no answer, save for the hum of the idling semi and the crickets hissing in the brush. When I reached her, I dropped quickly to my knees and swept the flashlight beam across her body, and the blood running across her skin smelled sickeningly sweet, thick, and viscous. It wasn't human blood at all, it was a crude, heavy mixture of cheap red paint and congealed animal gore designed to trick the eye in the dead of night. Before my brain could process the trap, the dry brush exploded behind me with a violent rustle. 3 massive men lunged out from the dense tree line, wielding heavy iron pipes and rusty machetes with savage, predatory grins plastered across their twisted faces. I scrambled backward on the loose gravel, raising the heavy iron crowbar, but they were entirely too fast for a man worn down by 20 hours behind the wheel. The first blow caught me squarely across the left knee with a sickening, echoing crack, shattering bone and sending a wave of white-hot agony straight up my spine. I collapsed instantly into the dirt, screaming as another iron pipe smashed heavily into my ribs, driving the air from my lungs in a violent explosion of pain. They didn't waste a single breath on words, treating me like cattle at a slaughterhouse. They swarmed over me like wild animals, beating me mercilessly until my vision blurred into a swirling vortex of black and red, my bones splintering under the unrelenting rain of heavy metal strikes. As the agonizing darkness finally dragged me under, I felt their heavy hands grab me by my jacket collar and drag my broken, bleeding body across the rough gravel. They tossed me unceremoniously into the cold, dark aluminum floor of my own trailer, among the stacked pallets of cargo, leaving me to bleed to death in the locked dark while they climbed into the cab and stole my livelihood away into the night. The absolute dark inside the trailer was thick with the suffocating stench of diesel fumes, rotting cardboard, and my own fresh, copper-scented blood pooling rapidly beneath the wooden pallets. Every single breath I drew sent a jagged shard of white-hot agony through my shattered ribs, tearing at my lungs with every microscopic expansion of my chest. My left leg hung at an impossible, grotesque angle where the iron pipe had crushed the kneecap into powder, leaving the joint dangling by raw muscle and torn shreds of denim. Outside the thin aluminum walls of the cargo bay, the muffled, guttural roars and triumphant laughter of the three animals who had ambushed me echoed over the steady, pounding rhythm of the heavy diesel engine. They were sharing cheap whiskey, celebrating their fresh kill and the effortless acquisition of a multi-ton freight liner loaded with high-value black-market goods. I dragged my useless, shattered lower body across the splintered floorboards, leaving a thick, glistening smear of crimson in my wake, my fingernails clawing desperately at the stacked cargo boxes in a frantic, hopeless search for anything heavy enough to smash the locking mechanism of the rear rolling door. My fingers slipped against the smooth cardboard, slick with my own gore, as wave after wave of nauseating dizziness washed over my brain. The truck bounced violently as it slammed through a deep pothole on the unpaved back road, throwing my broken body hard against a heavy steel crate and tearing a muffled, raw scream from my bleeding throat. Through the thin seams of the rear doors, the faint, flickering amber glow of the highway horizon cut razor-thin lines across the pitch-black interior, mocking my final moments of life. They weren't just thieves, they were highway butchers who harvested trucks and left the drivers to rot in shallow desert graves or forgotten ditches. As my vision began to fracture into blinding white static and the agonizing pain in my chest slowly melted into a numb, freezing void, I realized with absolute horror that my bones would serve as nothing more than permanent ballast for their next cargo run, buried deep beneath the merciless Alabama clay where no rescue would ever find me. Every jolt of the suspension sent fresh waves of tearing pain through my mutilated limbs, reminding me that I was trapped in a moving metal coffin driven by monsters who viewed my life as worth less than the scrap metal of the chassis. The laughter from the cab filtered back through the floorboards like the mocking jeers of demons, sharp and cruel against the steady hum of the tires chewing up the midnight miles. I tried to squeeze my eyes shut to block out the suffocating blackness, but the darkness inside my own skull was even more terrifying, filled with the echoing memory of the iron pipes coming down like sledgehammers against my flesh. My pulse fluttered erratically in my throat, weak and fluttering like a dying moth trapped in a web, as the cold iron floor slowly drained the last remaining heat from my shivering frame. The metal walls of the trailer seemed to close in closer and closer, pressing down with the weight of an entire mountain as the final drops of my life bled away into the splintered wood, leaving nothing behind but a nameless corpse rattling in the dark. My name is Ernest, and back in the freezing, biting chill of the autumn of 1981, at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, I was wrestling my heavy-duty rig through the winding, treacherous switchbacks of the Appalachian Mountains in Virginia. The night was choked by a thick, freezing mountain fog that reduced my visibility to mere inches, turning my windshield into a sheet of condensation while the rhythmic swish, thud, swish, thud of the wiper blades kept a hypnotic, maddening pace against the glass. My breath plumed into thick white clouds inside the freezing cab, the old heater core hissing feebly and offering nothing against the deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to freeze the very marrow in my bones. As I crept around a blind, sharp curve near a crumbling stone bridge, my high beams caught a lonely figure standing motionless on the frosted gravel shoulder, completely exposed to the elements. It was an old man wearing a tattered wool coat, clutching an ancient wooden acoustic guitar tightly against his chest, his thumb raised in a slow, deliberate hitchhiker's gesture that chilled me to the core. Against every survival instinct screaming in the back of my mind, I pumped the air brakes and brought the massive semi to a grinding, groaning halt that echoed through the empty canyon. The passenger door swung open with a loud creak, letting in a sudden draft of glacial air as the old man climbed up into the cab without uttering a single word. He slid heavily onto the passenger seat, bringing with him a strange, suffocating odor that completely overwhelmed the smell of stale coffee and diesel, the distinct, heavy scent of burning temple incense, dried autumn flowers, and damp church soil. I threw the transmission into gear and eased back onto the slick asphalt, casting nervous glances toward my silent companion in the dim, greenish glow of the dashboard instruments. His face was completely obscured by deep shadows, his head bowed low, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something deeply unnatural. The rearview mirror mounted above the windshield caught the interior of the cab, yet where the old man sat, the glass showed nothing at all. Just an empty vinyl seat. Before I could choke out a warning or slam on the brakes, the old man slowly raised his right hand, a hand that shimmered faintly at the edges like dissolving smoke, and placed his ice-cold fingers directly over my knuckles where they gripped the gear shifter. A pale, milky mist began to pour from his sleeves, curling around the steering wheel and freezing the digital clock display instantly. "I was murdered in this exact valley 40 years ago, driver," a voice echoed softly inside my skull, devoid of all warmth yet carrying the weight of a century of sorrow. "And you are the final carrier. Take my burden, so my soul may finally rest." The terrifying weight of his words hung heavily in the freezing air, pressing down on my chest like a slab of cold granite as the truck rolled forward into the impenetrable mountain mist. My fingers grew entirely numb beneath his touch, the frost crawling up my forearms and turning my blood to ice while the ancient wooden guitar on his lap began to vibrate with a low, ungodly hum that rattled the dashboard screws loose. I tried to pull my hand away, but my muscles refused to obey my commands, completely locked under the paralyzing spell of the phantom rider who shared my cab. The silver pendant burned against the palm of my hand like a glowing coal fresh from a furnace, radiating a deep, pulsing heat that seemed to seep straight through my skin and into the marrow of my bones. The heavy semi sat completely paralyzed in the middle of the dark, fog-choked mountain pass, its massive diesel engine stone dead, refusing to turn over even when I jammed the key forward and pumped the starter pedal until the electrical wiring hissed with angry white sparks. Outside the side windows, the freezing autumn fog began to swirl in unnatural, circular patterns, pressing hard against the glass like 100 clutching hands searching for a way inside the cab. The air grew instantly thick, heavy with the suffocating stench of rotting autumn leaves, damp earth, and the unmistakable, coppery tang of spilled human blood that hadn't dried in 4 decades. I stared into the rearview mirror, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs, and watched as the empty passenger seat behind me began to ripple and warp. A tall, skeletal figure materialized slowly out of the shadows, its tattered wool coat shredded into ribbons, its empty eye sockets glowing with a dull, sickly amber luminescence that mirrored the dying amber lights of the dashboard. It didn't walk, it glided across the floorboards of the cab, its long, gray fingers stretching out toward my throat with terrifying, agonizing slowness. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords were locked tight, paralyzed by a supernatural frost that reached deep into my chest and squeezed the life out of my lungs. "The valley claims its own," a chorus of 1,000 hollow voices whispered simultaneously inside my skull, vibrating my teeth until I thought enamel would shatter from the sound. The skeletal hand closed around my windpipe, not with physical flesh and bone, but with an icy, crushing weight of pure sorrow and eternal damnation, dragging my consciousness down into the dark, frozen soil where the old man's bones had rested undisturbed since 1941. The road belongs to the ghosts now, and my soul was the final toll required to clear the pass. As the freezing soil of the Appalachian Canyon filled my lungs and my vision dissolved into an endless ocean of gray ash, I realized that no trucker ever truly escapes the mountain once the phantom passenger climbs aboard. Every switchback of that desolate highway now bore my invisible footprint, locked forever in the amber glow of a dashboard that would never shut off. The ancient wooden guitar echoed its final, haunting chord through the empty night air, signaling that the trade had been completed and a new ghost now guarded the winding turns of the pass. The chilling reality settled into the eternal stillness of my ruined frame as the mountain winds howled their approval through the fractured grille of the abandoned truck. No rescue crew would ever find the rig where it sat parked against the mist-shrouded bridge, because down here in the permanent shadows of the gorge, time stood frozen in perpetual twilight, watching for the next unsuspecting set of headlights to crest the rise and offer up a fresh soul to the endless dark of the highway. My name is Miguel, and back in the blistering summer heat of 1975, at exactly 50 minutes past 2 in the morning, I was hauling a high-value cargo run across the lawless, wooded borderlands tucked between Mexico and Arizona. The night was pitch black, the dense canopy of pine trees blocking out what little starlight managed to pierce the heavy desert haze, casting long, twisting shadows that danced across the windshield like living phantoms. The heavy diesel engine thrummed beneath my feet, vibrating deep through the floorboards and rattling my teeth as I navigated a tight, unpaved logging trail specifically designed to bypass federal inspection checkpoints and law enforcement radars. The air inside the cab was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco, stale sweat, and heated oil, wrapping around me like a heavy woolen blanket while I clutched the steering wheel with intense concentration. Without warning, a deafening explosion ripped through the front left wheel well, ****, followed instantly by a violent, metallic screech as the rubber tire shredded violently to ribbons against hidden steel spikes buried in the dirt. Instinct took over my body in a fraction of a second. I fought the violently jerking steering wheel with both hands, muscles straining and veins bulging in my neck as I wrestled the heavy semi to a skidding, dust-choked stop on the narrow roadside. I killed the engine, plunging the cab into total, suffocating darkness save for the dim, flickering amber glow of the instrument panel. I reached down beside my seat, my trembling fingers wrapping tightly around the checkered grip of a heavy hunting knife, and pushed the heavy cab door open into the humid night. "Quien anda ahi?" I shouted into the thick brush, my voice echoing hollowly through the towering trees, a desperate bluff masking the cold panic rising in my throat. The only answer was the dry rustle of autumn leaves underfoot and the sharp, ominous, metallic click of multiple firearm bolts being racked in unison in the surrounding darkness. Before my boots fully hit the loose dirt, four masked figures erupted from the dense tree line like shadows coming to life, surrounding the rig with cold, calculated military precision. They weren't ordinary highway thieves looking for quick cash, they were seasoned cartel enforcers who knew every inch of these smuggling trails and showed absolute, ruthless zero mercy to outsiders. I lunged forward with a savage, desperate roar, driving the heavy hunting knife straight into the chest of the closest attacker, feeling the blade sink deep into flesh and dropping him instantly into the dust. But the others swarmed me like wolves bringing down a wounded stag, giving me no time to pull the blade free. A heavy iron bar caught me square across the collarbone, snapping the bone with a sickening, echoing pop and sending me crashing hard to my knees in the dirt. They tore the knife violently from my grip, raining brutal, merciless blows down upon my back, my arms, and my head as I fought desperately for every breath, coughing up warm blood onto the rocks. I lashed out with my boots in a final, futile act of defiance, catching one in the shin, but it only fueled their vicious, cold-blooded anger. A heavy combat boot slammed directly into the side of my skull with skull-crushing force, the world flashing a blinding, searing white before dissolving into total, permanent blackness. As I bled out slowly into the dry Mexican dirt, my last sight was the heavy boots of the assassins walking over my broken body to climb up into the cab and claim my stolen trailer. The dry, choking dust of the lawless borderland tasted heavily of copper, gunpowder, and my own warm blood, pooling rapidly around my shattered cheekbones where the heavy combat boots of the cartel enforcers had caved in my facial structure, leaving a jagged crater of broken bone and torn flesh that throbbed with a relentless, white-hot agony. My right arm was bent backward at an agonizing, completely unnatural angle, the fractured humerus bone protruding sharply through the blood-soaked fabric of my flannel shirt, stark white and glistening morbidly in the faint, silvery starlight filtering down through the dense, towering pine canopy. Above me, the muffled, aggressive shouting of the cartel enforcers echoed harshly in rapid Spanish as they scrambled wildly over the aluminum hood of my truck, their heavy boots clanking against the metal grid while they tore open the heavy cargo doors of the trailer to inspect the multi-million-dollar contraband packed tightly inside the wooden crates. I lay completely paralyzed in the dirt, unable to twitch a single finger or summon the strength to cry out, every shallow, wheezing breath rattling painfully through a collapsed lung filled with warm fluid, chemical diesel exhaust, and suffocating desert dust. A sharp, stabbing agony radiated directly from the base of my skull every single time the heavy diesel engine roared to life above me, shaking the loose earth and small rocks beneath my broken spine with a violent, rhythmic throb that threatened to tear my consciousness apart entirely. They didn't even bother to waste a clean bullet to finish me off. To those cold-blooded bastards, I was already dead meat, just another nameless, disposable body meant to be swallowed entirely by the lawless border wilderness before the federal patrol started their morning sweeps across the highway. Every second stretched into an eternity of silent torment as the freezing night wind cut through my torn clothes, blowing dust and pine needles across my unblinking eyes while the distant hum of the forest creatures mocked my helpless state. I could hear the frantic clatter of wooden boxes being tossed aside inside the trailer as the thieves inventoried their stolen prize, laughing among themselves at how easily they had neutralized the lone driver who dared cross their territory. The heavy scent of burning rubber and scorched oil filled the air as the driver threw the transmission into reverse, spinning the remaining tires in the dirt and showering my broken face with abrasive grit before straightening out for the haul. As the massive semi ground its heavy gears, lurched forward with a massive cloud of black, choking smoke, and drove directly over my lower legs with a sickening crunch of grinding tires and splintered bone, the blinding white pain finally faded into a heavy, freezing blackness. My warm blood stained the Arizona soil a deep, permanent crimson, marking yet another forgotten, unmarked grave along the midnight freight lines where human life was worth less than a single pallet of stolen goods, leaving my broken soul to haunt the desolate border forever. The absolute silence that followed the departure of the semi was heavier and more suffocating than the dense pine canopy or the thick layers of desert dust sealing my cracked lips. My consciousness flickered like a dying candle wick in a drafty hallway, desperately clinging to the edge of existence while the freezing night air began to harden the pool of blood slowly spreading beneath my mangled torso. Every nerve ending in my body screamed in unison, sending blinding flashes of white-hot agony shooting up my spine whenever the cold night breeze shifted my broken collarbone or moved the jagged shards of bone piercing through my skin. Out in the pitch-black wilderness, the nocturnal predators had already begun to take notice of the fresh scent of death, their low, guttural growls echoing faintly from the deeper ravines of the canyon as they caught the rich, metallic aroma of spilled blood drifting on the midnight wind. I tried to force my eyes open, but my eyelids felt like heavy lead weights crusted over with dried blood and dirt, leaving me trapped in a terrifying, claustrophobic darkness of my own mind where the only sound was the frantic, erratic hammering of my failing heart. Memories of my life before this desolate stretch of highway flashed briefly behind my closed eyes, the warmth of a kitchen in Sonora, the sound of my mother's voice humming old folk melodies, and the simple dreams of a young man who just wanted to earn an honest living behind the wheel instead of ending up as a nameless statistic in the desert. All of it was washed away by the merciless reality of the cartel's borderland, where human lives were traded like commodities and dumped in the brush like discarded trash by men who felt no more remorse than a butcher carving meat. The distant hum of the stolen semi's engine finally faded entirely into the wind, leaving me utterly alone with the creeping chill of hypothermia and the slow, rhythmic dripping of my own life slipping away into the earth, soaking deep into the roots of the ancient trees. As the hours dragged on like centuries, the physical pain slowly gave way to a strange, floating numbness, a deceptive comfort that signaled the final shutting down of my vital organs as the cold crept higher up my chest. I could feel my spirit detaching itself from the ruined, broken cage of my flesh, hovering just inches above the bloody dirt to look down upon the tragic tableau of my final defeat, watching the ants crawl over my torn knuckles and feeling the absolute weightlessness of the afterlife calling to me from the void. A sudden, sharp rustle in the surrounding bushes broke the quiet as a pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the darkness, fixing their predatory gaze directly upon my lifeless physical shell with terrifying detachment. I watched without fear as the wild beast stepped closer, realizing that in this lawless wasteland, even our remains did not belong to us, but were destined to become mere fuel for the unforgiving cycle of nature. As the first faint, pale streaks of dawn began to bleed through the upper branches of the towering pines, painting the gray sky in sickly shades of violet and amber, I knew no rescue crew or federal patrol would ever trace my final coordinates in this forgotten labyrinth of dirt tracks. The border had claimed another driver, and my ghost would forever walk these hidden logging trails, watching from the shadows as future trucks rolled past into the endless dark, forever warning those foolish enough to brave the midnight freight lines. The morning sun did not bring warmth to the desolate stretch of the Arizona-Mexico border. Instead, its pale, sickly rays cast long, distorted shadows across the patch of blood-soaked dirt where my mortal existence had been snuffed out hours before. My physical body lay twisted in the brush, completely abandoned by the world of the living, but my consciousness remained tethered to the very spot where the heavy truck tires had crushed my bones into the earth. There was no tunnel of bright light or peaceful transition into an eternal paradise. There was only the endless expanse of towering pine trees, the whistle of the dry desert wind, and the haunting, permanent hum of the freight highway cutting through the valley. I stood invisible among the branches, looking down at my own ruined shell with a detached sense of curiosity, feeling neither pain nor sorrow, only the heavy, unchanging weight of unfinished business binding me to this cursed stretch of asphalt. Out on the logging trail, the morning routine of the borderlands began to stir, though no ordinary traveler or law enforcement officer ever dared to turn down this particular overgrown fork in the road. Far in the distance, a faint, rhythmic rumble vibrated through the ground, the unmistakable sound of a heavy diesel engine straining against an uphill climb, shifting gears through the mountain pass as another unsuspecting driver took a gamble on a shortcut to beat the federal inspection stations. A cold shiver ran down my non-existent spine, reminding me of the exact moment my own tires had hit those hidden steel spikes and sealed my fate under the cover of darkness. I watched as a massive, dust-covered semi came rumbling around the sharp curve, its high-beam headlights cutting weakly through the lingering morning haze, driven by a tired trucker who looked just as young and desperate as I had been only a lifetime ago. He had no idea about the cartel scouts hiding in the dense brush, no warning of the ambush waiting for him just past the next bend of towering oak and pine trees. Instinctively, I glided effortlessly through the air, passing straight through the closed passenger side window of the moving truck to settle into the empty seat beside him, wrapping myself in the ambient chill of the cab. The young driver glanced to his right, suddenly shivering as a sudden drop in temperature frosted the corners of the windshield and caused the radio static to flare into a sharp, piercing whine. He reached out with a trembling hand to turn up the heater, his eyes wide and anxious as he stared into the rearview mirror, searching the empty highway behind him for ghosts that hadn't yet caught up. "Keep your eyes on the road," I whispered into the rushing wind of the cabin, my voice carrying the hollow echo of 1,000 forgotten canyons, though to him it sounded like nothing more than a sudden gust rattling the exhaust pipe. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white as he sped past the very spot where my bones rested in the red dirt, plunging deeper into the lawless trap of the borderland. Dark shapes began to detach themselves from the tree line ahead, moving with the practiced stealth of predators scenting easy prey, their heavy iron bars and concealed firearms glinting under the pale light. I leaned closer to the terrified driver, watching his pulse hammer wildly against the skin of his throat, knowing exactly what horrors awaited him in the shadows just beyond the reach of his high beams. The cycle was about to repeat itself, and as the heavy rig rumbled forward toward the trap, I realized my eternal punishment was to bear witness to every single soul that the mountain chose to claim. I was no longer just a victim of the midnight freight lines, I had become part of the mountain itself, an eternal warning signal bound to every truck that dared to roll past the twilight hour, forever riding shotgun through the valley of the dead. The wheels of the heavy rig kicked up a thick plume of orange dust as it surged past the warning sign that had long since rusted away into the overgrown brush, carrying its terrified driver deeper into the jaws of the trap. From my vantage point on the passenger side dash, I watched the young trucker's face tighten into a mask of pure panic as his dashboard lights flickered erratically and died, plunging the cab into total, suffocating darkness. In the rearview mirror, the dense pine forest seemed to shift in close ranks behind the trailer, cutting off all light from the outside world and sealing us inside a moving tomb of metal, rubber, and lingering ghost stories. The cartel enforcers didn't even need to use the steel spikes this time. The mountain itself laid out its invisible traps, bending the geography of the trail into an endless, looping nightmare from which no vehicle could ever truly escape. "Turn back," I murmured again, my voice wrapping around the steering column like a freezing fog, frosting the glass and freezing the sweat on the driver's forehead as he fought to keep his hands from slipping off the wheel. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, desperate to outrun the sudden drop in temperature and the creeping shadows that now clawed at the side windows of the cab, but the diesel engine only choked, sputtering thick black smoke into the night. Ahead of us, the headlights illuminated four motionless figures standing directly in the center of the unpaved trail, holding heavy iron bars and staring blankly into the glare with dead, hollow eyes that reflected no light. They weren't living men anymore, the borderland had consumed them too, trapping their violent spirits in an endless cycle of ambushes alongside the very drivers they had once murdered in cold blood. The young trucker let out a strangled, desperate scream as he yanked the wheel hard to the left, but the semi refused to turn, sliding smoothly across the dirt as if guided by invisible hands straight toward the waiting figures. I watched the terror paralyze his limbs as the massive grille of the truck bore down on the phantoms, realizing with a chilling clarity that every ambush we relived was a punishment shared by the hunters and the hunted alike in this forgotten purgatory. The impact did not shatter the phantoms, instead, they passed right through the steel bumper as if it were smoke, their hollow eyes locking onto the driver through the shattered windshield as time itself seemed to fracture around us. I closed my eyes, or rather, focused the infinite awareness of my spirit, as the inevitable metal-on-metal crash echoed through the canyon, blending with the sound of breaking glass and shattering bone that felt entirely too familiar. Another life extinguished, another soul added to the restless legion of the highway, forever bound to walk the midnight freight routes of the Arizona border without ever finding peace or redemption. As the silence returned to the pass, settling like a heavy shroud over the twisted wreckage, I drifted back out through the shattered windshield and rose into the upper branches of the towering pines, looking down at the endless ribbon of highway stretching out into the dark. My journey as a living man ended the night my tires hit the spikes, but my watch as the guardian of the road would never cease, waiting patiently for the next set of headlights to crest the rise and offer up a new passenger to the eternal night. The heavy, suffocating wreckage of the last truck faded slowly into the swirling gray mist of the early dawn, dissolving completely into the stained red dirt of the borderland as if it had never existed at all, leaving behind only the eternal, melancholic whisper of the wind weaving through the dense, towering pine canopy. I floated motionless in the thin morning air above the desolate stretch of highway, feeling the familiar, rhythmic thrum of the borderland vibrating deep beneath my ethereal form, a vast, silent expanse of lawless terrain stretching across the horizon into infinite, unforgiving darkness. The sun climbed sluggishly into the pale, washed-out Arizona sky, offering no true warmth to the freezing canyon, instead casting long, skeletal shadows across the hidden logging trails that crisscrossed the valley like veins of black iron carrying poison through the earth. Down on the cracked asphalt, the physical remnants of my past life, along with the fresh tragedy of the night before, were entirely gone, swallowed whole by the voracious wilderness that claimed everything and everyone foolish enough to venture past the twilight hour without proper respect for the ancient, vengeful spirits of the road. Yet, the midnight freight routes never stayed empty for long. This desolate corridor was a relentless, unyielding machine, constantly feeding on the blind ambition, the crushing debt, and the desperate hope of young men who believed they could outsmart the invisible dangers of the border for a quick paycheck. I turned my transparent gaze westward, toward the jagged peaks of the mountain pass where the deteriorating asphalt curved sharply out of sight into a wall of dense fog, and felt the very first faint, distant vibration humming through the deep roots of the earth. It was a low, guttural subharmonic frequency that only the dead could truly appreciate, the unmistakable, heavy growl of a twin-turbo diesel engine straining against a steep uphill climb, shifting through high-torque gears as another unsuspecting driver took a reckless gamble on a shortcut designed to bypass the federal inspection checkpoints. A sharp, phantom pain flared briefly through my non-existent ribs, a residual memory of the night my own steering column had crushed my chest, reminding me of the exact brand of youthful arrogance that drove these men straight into the jaws of the beast. I watched as a massive, dust-caked semi came rumbling aggressively around the blind curve, its high-beam headlights cutting a narrow, desperate beam of yellow light through the lingering afternoon haze, driven by a trucker whose profile I could barely make out through the tinted glass. He looked exhausted, his face illuminated only by the harsh, flickering glow of his dashboard instruments, knuckles clamped so tightly around the steering wheel that his hands resembled pale bone. He had no idea about the cartel scouts who still watched from the shadows, no warning of the invisible spikes waiting just around the bend, and certainly no inkling that a restless ghost was waiting to hitch a ride in the passenger seat. I let out a slow, silent sigh that stirred the thick dust resting on the abandoned warning signs by the roadside, feeling the immense, crushing weight of eternity settle once more across my shoulders as I prepared to descend from the towering pines. My watch as the guardian, the silent warning, and the eternal passenger of the midnight freight lines would never truly end. I was bound forever to this stretch of highway, floating endlessly between the world of the living and the abyss of the dead. As the truck drew closer, its tires crunching loudly over the loose gravel, I drifted down like a falling autumn leaf, passing effortlessly through the cold glass of the passenger side window to settle into the empty cab, ready to welcome yet another living soul to the eternal night. The interior of the cab was thick with the scent of cheap black ice air freshener, stale energy drinks, and the metallic tang of exhaustion radiating from the driver slumped over the wheel. I settled invisibly into the passenger seat, my ethereal presence dropping the cabin temperature instantly, causing a web of frost to fan across the windshield's corner. The driver, whose name tag read Leo, shivered violently as the cold washed over him, his tired eyes darting toward the frosted glass before he jammed his foot down on the accelerator. "Don't push it," I whispered into the ventilation system, my voice sounding like a draft rattling the radio speaker. He didn't hear the words, but he felt their chilling intent, his hands tightening so hard on the steering wheel that the horn button clicked in the dark. Outside the windows, the pine trees accelerated backward in a blur, the shadows stretching long under the weak headlights as we approached the mile marker where my journey had terminated. The dash clock flashed 3:15 a.m., though outside the sky remained trapped in an unnatural twilight, bathed in the sickly green glow of the borderland's purgatory. Suddenly, the engine's rumble was joined by a heavier sound, a metallic growl echoing from the blind spot directly behind our trailer. Leo's eyes widened in horror as he glanced into the mirror, illuminating a massive, rust-caked semi riding 6 inches off our rear bumper without its lights. It was a ghost rig, driven by the phantom of a smuggler who had died a decade ago, its exhaust pipe spewing thick, oily black smoke smelling of scorched rubber. The phantom semi locked against our rear frame with a screech of tortured steel, sending a violent shockwave through the cab that knocked Leo's thermos spilling across the floor. The aroma of coffee mixed with the sickening stench of sulfur and burnt fluid, turning the air inside the cabin thick and toxic. Leo let out a raw sob of terror, hammering the brake pedal down, but the ghost truck refused to brake, pushing us down the mountain grade toward the switchback. "Get off me!" Leo screamed, swerving violently to the right, but the phantom semi phased halfway through our trailer, its rusted grille pressing against the doors. Out in the wilderness, the twisted silhouettes of ancient trees detached from the dirt banks, stretching out long fingers to claw at the aluminum siding. Leo wept openly, his hands shaking so violently on the wheel that the heavy rig drifted close to the sheer drop-off of the mountain pass. I watched the frantic pulse hammering against his throat, feeling a mixture of pity and cold detachment. We were permanent fixtures of this landscape now. Ahead, the asphalt began to ripple, transforming into a shifting sea of red dust and jagged iron spikes rising from the earth like a beast's teeth. The ghost truck slammed its bumper against us a second time, a calculated impact meant to snap our rear axle and send the rig tumbling down the ravine. As the tires lost grip on the gravel and the cab tilted over the edge of the abyss, Leo closed his eyes and screamed his mother's name into the dark. I leaned across the center console, looking into Leo's terrified eyes, feeling the tragic kinship of a soul about to be devoured by the endless loop of the midnight freight lines. The weight of the eternity bearing down upon the Arizona border was not measured in years or centuries, but in the relentless, rhythmic ticking of dashboard clocks and the endless rotation of heavy diesel tires carving paths through the dust. When the cab tilted completely over the edge of the rocky precipice, the sound of tearing metal and shattering safety glass dissolved instantly into a profound, suffocating silence that echoed across the entire length of the canyon. There was no fiery explosion at the bottom of the ravine, no chaotic rescue sirens wailing in the distance, and no flashing red and blue lights of a state trooper patrol cresting the ridge to offer aid. Instead, the mountain simply swallowed the wreckage whole, folding Leo's heavy rig into the dark strata of earth and stone where my own skeleton and the rusted frames of a dozen other forgotten trucks already lay buried in eternal darkness. I hovered in the open air just above the tree line, watching the dust settle across the empty stretch of asphalt as if nothing had ever happened, feeling the strange, hollow calm that always followed the closure of a midnight ambush. Leo's physical form had vanished into the wreckage below, but I knew his spirit was even now detaching itself from the broken cage of his flesh, rising upward through the pine branches to join the silent, watchful legion of the highway. We were no longer drivers, smugglers, or victims. We were the permanent guardians of the borderland, bound by blood and tragedy to the very asphalt that had tricked us into taking the wrong fork in the road. Out in the surrounding thickets, the nocturnal wildlife watched us with ancient, unblinking eyes, recognizing that we had become as much a part of the local geography as the jagged boulders and the towering, weather-beaten pines. Far down the valley, past the jagged peaks where the highway wound its way toward the distant state line, a faint pinprick of yellow light flickered against the horizon, marking the approach of a brand new set of headlights cutting through the twilight. Another young trucker, desperate to beat the dawn inspection stations and earn a meager living on the dark freight lines, was currently gripping his steering wheel with the exact same blind confidence that had led all of us to our doom. He had no idea that the road beneath his tires was alive, nor that the shadows lining the shoulder were populated by the ghosts of every man who had ever dared to challenge the midnight freight routes. The invisible gears of the mountain began to turn once more, bending the geography of the trail and summoning the restless phantoms back to their designated stations along the overgrown logging path. I let out one final, lingering sigh that stirred the dust across the empty road, feeling the chill of the approaching midnight settle deep into my non-existent bones as I turned my gaze back toward the horizon. My journey as a living man had ended long ago under the cover of a starless sky, but my watch as the eternal passenger of the midnight freight lines would never cease. As the new headlights crested the ridge and began their steady descent into the canyon, casting long, wavering beams across the cursed asphalt, I drifted smoothly back down toward the center of the road, ready to welcome the next traveler to the endless night. The yellow headlights grew steadily larger as they descended the twisting mountain pass, cutting a harsh, luminous gash through the dense, creeping fog that clung to the shoulders of the desolate Arizona highway. From my vantage point hovering above the center stripe of the asphalt, I watched the massive freight truck emerge from the shadows, its heavy diesel engine roaring with a defiant, throaty power that echoed off the canyon walls. It was a mirror image of the night I had taken this cursed detour, carrying the same cargo of exhausted ambition, unpaid debts, and the reckless belief that shortcuts could outsmart the lawless borderlands. Inside the elevated cab, another young driver was slumped over the steering wheel, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow from hours of driving without sleep, illuminated only by the dull green glow of the dashboard instruments. I felt no malice toward him, nor any shred of pity. We were all merely instruments of the mountain now, cogs in an ancient, endless machine that fed upon the restless souls of those who walked the midnight freight lines. As the truck drew closer to the exact mile marker where my mortal life had been snuffed out, the air around the vehicle grew abruptly frigid, frosting the side windows and causing the stereo speakers to emit a sharp, piercing whine of static. The driver cursed under his breath, slapping the dashboard in frustration as he reached out to turn the dial, completely unaware that his uninvited passenger had already slipped effortlessly through the closed window. I settled back into the passenger seat, wrapping myself in the familiar ambient chill of the cab, feeling the familiar, rhythmic vibration of the chassis beneath my non-existent feet. Out in the dense wilderness flanking the highway, the shadows of the towering pines seemed to stretch and shift, reaching out toward the moving rig like the grasping fingers of 1,000 buried phantoms eager to welcome a new arrival. The digital clock on the dash flickered violently before settling on 3:33 a.m., locking the vehicle into the timeless zone where the laws of the living world no longer held any power or meaning. Ahead of us, the dense wall of pine trees parted slightly, revealing the hidden fork in the road where the rusted warning signs lay half buried in the red dirt, whispering promises of a faster route to the state line. The driver's gaze flicked toward the turnoff, his tired mind weighing the risks for a fraction of a second before he gripped the wheel tighter and began to ease his foot off the accelerator, drawn irresistibly toward the trap. I leaned closer to his ear, letting out a soft, freezing breath that ruffled the hair at the back of his neck, echoing the eternal warning that no one ever truly heeded in time. "Turn back," I whispered into the rushing wind of the cabin, knowing full well he would drive straight ahead into the dark. The heavy rig surged forward past the threshold, its tires kicking up a thick cloud of orange dust that settled like a shroud over the empty road, sealing another soul inside the eternal purgatory of the border. Far behind us, the mountain peaks stood silent and watchful under the pale moonlight, guarding their secrets and waiting patiently for the next set of headlights to crest the distant ridge. My watch on the midnight freight lines would never end, floating forever between the living and the dead, a silent witness to the endless cycle of the road that had claimed us all. The digital clock on the dash locked permanently at 3:33 a.m., freezing time in its tracks as the heavy freight rig crossed the invisible threshold into the deepest heart of the borderland. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the young driver's reflection in the frosted windshield, his face bathed in the ghostly, pulsing amber glow of instruments that no longer measured anything real in this timeless void. Out in the blackness beyond the glass, the mountain pass began to narrow sharply, the towering pine trees closing ranks to form an impenetrable wall of shadow that choked out the very stars overhead and swallowed the faint moonlight. There were no more detours to take, no more federal checkpoints to outsmart, and no more chances to turn back toward the safety of the living world. We had reached the absolute end of the line, where the highway dissolved into eternity. The heavy diesel engine let out one final, shuddering sigh before the motor died entirely, cutting off the blinding headlights and plunging the cab into a profound, absolute darkness that smelled heavily of dust, old iron, and damp earth. The driver let out a soft, confused gasp, his hands dropping from the steering wheel as the chilling realization of what had truly happened settled over his tired, overwhelmed mind, freezing his breath in the air. I reached out, my ethereal hand resting gently on his trembling shoulder, feeling the last fading warmth of mortal life slowly drain away into the freezing air of the cabin to join the collective chill of the pass. "Welcome home," I whispered into the stillness, my voice carrying the weight of 1,000 midnight journeys across the desolate Arizona desert, echoing against the metal panels like a fading radio transmission. Outside, the ghostly figures of past drivers and fallen smugglers began to emerge from the rolling mist, lining the edges of the unpaved trail with silent, watchful eyes as they greeted another soul into their eternal legion. A profound, melancholic peace washed over the desolate landscape as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, ending the frantic race against time that every trucker foolishly thought they could win. Far beyond the twisting ridge where the world of the living continued its oblivious march, the distant rumble of tomorrow's traffic was already beginning to stir, oblivious to the ancient trap waiting in the dark. Yet down here, beneath the endless canopy of skeletal pines and the eternal haze of the red dirt valley, time had ceased its march, leaving only the quiet echoes of shifting gears and fading footsteps. As the seasons turned without ever changing the eternal night of the canyon, and the wind carried the low, haunting whispers of new engines cresting the distant horizon, we knew our vigil had only just begun. My own long journey, which had begun so many miles and lifetimes ago beneath the cover of darkness, finally dissolved into the collective heartbeat of the mountain, becoming one with the earth and the wind. We were no longer victims of the road, nor were we passengers seeking an escape. We were the road itself, bound forever to the midnight freight lines that would never stop running through the dark.